good morning everyone. My name's Ella. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper that was part of my master's thesis. I worked on this with Dave Benno and Frederick Snyder over in Austria. So corruption's always been around. We've had an interest in it since the beginning of time. So we've got ancient examples of the serpent in Eden, which was seen as the corruption. So recently in economics, it's been ambiguous and caused great theoretical debate. So stamping out corruption has been of interest to international agencies for the last 30 years. It's difficult to define, and Transparency International has given us a very broad definition that corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But if you look into it further, Transparency International then expands this definition to various states, including petty, grand, political, and it also depends on the sector and the amount of money lost. Now, just a brief introduction to the corruption literature. Getting really into it, the true impact of corruption is actually unknown. It's ridiculously ambiguous. We've got studies at a macro and micro level that show it can reduce slowness, but in the long run can also cause slowness. The cause is constantly debated. Corruption's said to influence gender, education, religion, urbanisation, government systems, economic policies, legal origin, but they still can't narrow it down to a single cause. Now, me personally, when I was looking at corruption, I started to think it had a lot to do with culture. Now, culture you can't measure from an economic perspective, but you can kind of control for it in variables. So economic anthropology has addressed corruption a fair bit recently. So it tries to take the performative judgment away from corruption. So rather than looking at things as a bribe and a gift or the appropriation of public goods and privatisation, it starts to bring it into a more cultural perspective. So thinking about culture and going back to 1995 when Morrow penned the idea that corruption could either gross or throw sand in the wheels of economic development, I started to think that what if corruption was actually two separate activities that in studies had been thrown together as a single one? So thinking of the grease on the wheels hypothesis, where it does help economic development, there was a paper back in 1985 by Liu that talked about how corruption can be used to reduce inefficiencies and red tape in bureaucracy. So what if this type of corruption was systemic corruption and people and citizens are actually bribing to get around these inefficiencies, but international agencies still see it as a type of corruption? The other side of the coin we have is our rent-seeking corruption. So this is developed from our sand in the wheels hypothesis, and this is all the bad that comes with corruption. It is the abuse of power for private gain, and it is the type of corruption that does destroy economies. Now, thinking of corruption as two separate activities, what if we could also tailor our measurements based on economic anthropology and looking at the areas of corruption and the regions and start to tailor our variables a little bit nicer rather than doing a whole panel data analysis? So what we decided to do, looking at the literature, structural equation modelling seemed to be the most popular method. It was used by Frederick Snyder a lot with his undergrad economy studies. So we use the multiple indicator, multiple causes model, so called the MIMIC model for short. And in our study, we basically used maximum likelihood missing variables and then maximum likelihood estimation as a little bit of a robustness check. Now, there's just a few assumptions that we have to think about when it comes to a MIMIC model, and more specifically maximum likelihood missing variables and maximum likelihood estimation. So firstly, the data needs to be normally distributed, which was not a great thing to deal with. So some of our variables have been transformed just to smooth the data a little bit more. The sample size has to be over 200. And basically what this model does is it estimates the group differences of an unobservable latent variable through multivariate regressions. So in our study, corruption is going to be used as a latent variable, which is our unobserved variable. There's no actual measurement for it, and we're going to use our indicative and causal variables to model this. So our indicative variables are going to be on the right side of the model and our causal variables on the left. Just to ensure robustness, and there were a few variables in the literature that were quite contradictory, we've just modeled them both ways just to see what they do. So this is our model. It's easier for me to show it to you like this rather than all the equations that come through straighter because it's a bit of a nightmare, honestly. So on our left-hand side, we've got our causal variables and our indicative variables on the right. So what we've basically done is 1980 to 2018, 24 countries in Latin America. Tax havens were taken out and countries that did not have complete data sets were also taken out. The issue with Latin America and narrowing down the countries is that not many of them actually report their full data sets. So law and order, government stability, bureaucratic quality, government cohesion, legislative strength, socioeconomic conditions, sorry, poverty is not meant to be there, were all taken from the International Country Risk Guide. Now, I know some of you may say there is some issues with correlation between these variables, but I did run a few checks beforehand and they're not overly correlated. The one thing with the mimic model is it does require some level of correlation, but not high correlation. It will not run if the correlations are too high, and it will not run if the correlations are too low. On the other side, we have our indicative variables. So we've got corruption perceptions. With this one, we ran international country risk guides, and we also ran Transparency International, GDP, inflation, foreign direct investment, and education. So that's our systemic model. We ran a separate model for rent seeking as well. So basically what we wanted to do was we tried to run them all at once and the models didn't work at all. So by splitting them, we've been able to show evidence that there actually might be two types of corruption. So our variables have been tailored. As you can see for our rent seeking one, we're doing Latin America. So I put homicide and unemployment in, and cement I took from inspiration from Drea et al. In 2007. So cement can actually be used as a proxy for corruption because basically it's a really great way to hide money. Business projects always seem to blow out, especially building ones. It's an exceptional way to hide money. Plus, back in 1975, Nigeria owed more than 2/3 of its need of corruption that the Western world could produce. Now, I do apologise if you can't see this quite well. I had trouble fitting the tables on. So basically, this is it. We've run systemic and rent seeking side by side. And if you can see it, there starts to get this really beautiful duality across the models. So this really beautiful positive negative relationship starts to move through. Now, just a few things I wanted to point out. As you can see in law and order, as law and order increases, you get a very small increase in systemic corruption, but a reduction in rent seeking, and this holds across all the models. Some other interesting things we found was the negative positive relationship between education in systemic and rent seeking corruption. So basically what we're seeing is that education, as it increases, systemic corruption starts to increase as well, but we have a reduction in rent seeking. So this could possibly suggest that there is an acceptable level of corruption within Latin America. We also see a reduction in foreign direct investment in regards to rent-seeking corruption, but an increase in systemic. And then, so sorry, that was the maximum likelihood missing variables table that we ran. So that's with socioeconomic conditions as socioeconomic conditions as a cause in the first 6 specifications and as a indicator in the last 6. And then the next table is with socioeconomic conditions removed. So as you can see in this last table, law and order, government cohesion, education, and foreign direct investment are all statistically significant, but their directionality depends on the type of corruption as well. Thank you.